I came to Peirce mostly by way of his writings on probability, because I think Peirce is like, to my mind at least, he's one of the few philosophers who, like, he really takes seriously some of the conceptual problems that surround the notion of probability itself. So he raises these very deep and difficult problems that I think we still don't have very satisfactory answers to concerning the nature of probability. And it was just very intriguing to read that stuff, because so many people take probability just to be kind of a notion that we've sort of worked out in one way or another. And, Peirce was pointing to sort of very deep conceptual difficulties with the concept. So one of the famous problems that Peirce poses, I think this is in his paper, entitled On the Doctrine of Chances. I might be misplacing it, but I think it's in that paper on the Doctrine of Chances, is this so-called problem of the single trial. I don't know if you ever heard of this problem. Probably in some variety you've heard of it. So the version that Peirce presents to the reader in that paper is as follows. It's like, so imagine a deck of cards. Okay. So we have like 50 cards in the deck, maybe 100 cards in the deck. All of the cards in the deck are red, except for one, which is black. Okay. So the deck is shuffled, and the top card, say, from the deck is selected and laid face down on the table. Now, God comes to you and he says, here's the deal. Okay. You're going to guess the color of this card, and then we're going to flip it over. If the card is red, if the card is the color that you guess, right? Sorry, the card is the color that you guess, then you'll be awarded eternal felicity and bliss. I'll transport you to heaven and forevermore, right?
Does he say eternal felicity?
He probably does. It's something akin to that. He's quite a poetic writer, so he probably says something like that. If you pick the color and it turns out to be, if you pick a color and it turns out to be wrong, then you will suffer eternal damnation forevermore, right? Those are the stakes. Okay. It's a one-off thing. We're not going to play this game over and over again, right? After the game is played, the deck and maybe the entire world, for all we know, will be like disintegrated. And all that will be left is you either enjoying the fruits of your correct choice, right? And experiencing this eternal felicity, or you suffering eternal damnation. That's all. That's it, right? Nothing more. So Peirce says, look, what should you pick? So this is the problem. This is the problem that Peirce raises, right? He's like, okay, so what should you pick? Like, immediately the mind, like, jumps to the conclusion that we ought to pick red here, because the preponderance of cards in the deck are red, right? Maybe 99 out of 100 cards in the deck are, it doesn't really matter. You can make it 999 out of 1,000 are red, right? So it's very natural to say the rational thing to do in this case is to pick red, right? But it's a one-shot thing, as Peirce points out. So what if it so happens that you pick red and you're rational for whatever reason, you claim to be rational in your choice, and it turns out that the card is black, right? It's the one card in the deck that's black. So what's your consolation here, right? What does that show you other than that, like, rationality was a terrible thing to exercise on this occasion, right? So, we have this kind of like intuitive judgment that the probability is higher of that card being red than of that card being black. The question that Peirce wants to interrogate by raising this kind of thought experiment is, how does that judgment, let's assume that it's correct, get connected up with a decision as to what is rational in this case, right? Knowing that this is a one-off case, right? And of course, it's not just the problem of the single trial is actually the problem of finite trials, because, as Peirce points out, like, all the probability tells you is something about the limiting behavior of, say, repeated draws from the deck. In any finite sample, you could get any crazy thing. It's consistent with whatever, whatever the probabilities might be. And so how do we attach, so to speak, this judgment of probability to a rational decision in this case as to what we ought to do? How do we translate, right, between the, let's say, descriptive claim that the card is much more likely to be red than it is to be black, and the normative claim that in this particular circumstance, where I'm given this one shot, I ought to pick red, right? That's the problem of the single trial. It's sort of, how do we affect that translation? What are the assumptions needed to affect that translation? And Peirce is, it's a very deep problem, actually. It sounds sort of simplistic, and but it's a really deep problem. It's not a problem so much for probability theory as it is a problem for why we should think that these facts about probability should play such an important role in the rational decision making of a finite agent, right? Knowing that at the end of the day, those probabilities don't actually constrain the behavior in any kind of real way, right, of a finite sample. So all the experiences of cards and dice that you're ever going to get in your life, right, it's perfectly consistent with dice being fair, that you're just going to have bad luck and end up broke, And in that case, like, what have the probabilities done for you other than end you up broke, right? That's the thought. And so Peirce's kind of provocative, ultimately I think it has to be wrong, but his provocative solution to the problem is to say that what bridges the gap between these claims about probability and the normative claims about what an agent ought to do, a finite agent ought to do, are certain kind of ethical convictions, if you will, on the part of the agent. Basically, you sort of have to believe that in choosing the red option in this particular case, that even if you yourself are only going to be affected by the outcome of this particular draw, you sort of have to conceptualize yourself as part of a much larger enterprise. You have to see yourself as like part of a society of people, a group of people who are going to be continuing to try these things out ad infinitum. You have to have faith, as Peirce puts it, you have to have faith that like the human project is something which is going to continue ad infinitum. And you have to participate in that human project. You have to see yourself when you make these decisions based on probability as participating in that much larger human project. That's the only way for Peirce that like probabilities have any kind of normative significance. They have normative significance only for agents who are involved in this collective activity of trying to figure things out about the world, making mistakes and correcting those mistakes, and gradually over time sort of approximating towards the right answer in the long run. But if you don't see yourself as part of that activity, then Peirce thinks none of this makes any, like from a rational point of view, there is no such thing as probabilistic rationality for a selfish agent. If you're a genuinely selfish agent who doesn't see yourself as part of this broader program, then there's no meaningful sense in which probabilities constrain your rational decision making. I think ultimately that must be wrong, but I think it's a really interesting, it shows the depth of the problem, right? That somebody as smart as Peirce would be led to that kind of conclusion. So I mean, he has a lot of interesting things to say about probability. He's also one of the, I think, few philosophers who argues against what you might think of as a kind of like Bayesian approach to probability, where probabilities are interpreted in subjective or epistemic terms. He argues against that view. And so his views on probability are like, really interesting. So that's probably how I got into Peirce at first. But then once you scratch the surface and you start discovering, this really rich corpus of philosophical work, it's hard not to get pulled in deeper.